Friends, and welcome back to another episode of Navigating Wellness. In this episode, we're going to be diving into something that's really close to my heart, and that is a love for travel. And we're going to be diving into something that is really close to my stomach too. So a double whammy, and that is really good food. Now, we all know travel can be great when the two work great in combination. However, if you need to navigate quite a restrictive diet, then it can make for quite a challenging experience, or perhaps some of those experiences that may put you off from ever wanting to travel again. Now this, unfortunately, was my experience in the very initial stages. Traveling with these dietary restrictions and not finding the right types of food can leave you feeling quite miserable on a vacation, where you end up having to undergo a fast, or just not finding the right food or consuming the wrong types of foods and getting an adverse reaction. But in this video, I'm going to share with you some tips, tricks, hacks that you can perhaps implement on your travels to help it go a little smoother. Now, I'm not saying I have everything figured out. There are sometimes when I do end up failing on my own advice and having to pay the price on these trips, but it does take a little bit of extra planning and much more attention to detail than it's usually called for when arranging some sort of travel. And in this video, I'm going to dive quite deep into all these various aspects to hopefully help these trips of yours or travels go much more smoothly from a dietary perspective. Now, the good thing is the world has evolved quite a lot since perhaps 5-10 years ago. There's a lot more options available in many of the jurisdictions. If you do your research, you'll find places that will cater for your dietary requirements, and you'll be able to find a way to potentially navigate. Now, I can't say this for all jurisdictions or all locations around the world. However, it has become a lot more easier than it was in the past. And the one thing that we don't want to do is end up living life in regret, saying, I wish I had traveled when I was younger, or I wish I didn't let these dietary restrictions get in the way of me doing something that I really enjoy. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. Let's start off by diving into the struggles of group travel, or traveling with a tour company, especially where you are the only person or one of few people which have these dietary restrictions. Now, many people may think traveling with a tour company can make for a really good experience because all you need to do is inform them of your dietary restrictions, sit back and relax, and everything else will be taken care of. Unfortunately, that has not been the case for me. I've often had the worst experiences from a dietary perspective on a number of these tour groups. And oftentimes we end up paying a really good price and noticing that they really do a very poor job catering for dietary requirements or restrictions. Now, the reason this happens is because a number of these tour companies, they end up catering for the masses, and the masses will generally have no dietary restrictions. So the restaurants or dining experiences they will go to will be the generic types of dietary experiences, catering for people that eat meat, that have gluten, that are able to consume dairy, and so it's a pretty standard type of meal that they'll get. And oftentimes, even if it's local delicacies, they'll be able to enjoy it without having to worry about the restrictions. Meanwhile, the chef will have to concoct some kind of meal to cater for your dietary restrictions. And in this case, you end up with the kind of exception on the menu. You don't really have much of a choice, and you have to eat something that may not be as sumptuous as what the people around you are consuming. So you have to endure everyone diving into local delicacies while you're there consuming a pretty bland meal, or meal that just doesn't do justice to your taste buds. Now, this can be really challenging, especially when these places do have other options that will cater for your exact dietary requirements. And that is why I find group travels to be the worst, because it restricts your choice quite severely and doesn't permit you the flexibility in enjoying meals at locations that cater for your dietary restrictions. And because you may not have the freedom to travel independently in these group settings, you may not be able to break away from the group and enjoy your own dietary experience. That is why generally I prefer traveling independently or with a group that will allow you the flexibility to manage your own dietary restrictions, where you are able to break away from the group and find a place that caters more adequately towards your dietary restrictions, especially if you're going to some of the major cities around the world, where you may be able to find a restaurant that's at least a vegan restaurant where they may have quite a few more options that are both vegan and gluten-free than having to settle for a restaurant that focuses on the conventional diet, being meat, fish, dairy, gluten, you name it. So that was one of the most important lessons that I've learned, and why generally I try to avoid these tour companies, because I generally find that they do a very poor job when it comes to managing these dietary restrictions. If you must join a tour group, however, I will share additional tips on how to navigate that as well. So with that, let's dive into the next section. Okay, so what's the one thing that you can do to make traveling with these dietary restrictions quite a breeze? Unfortunately, you need to plan ahead. You need to plan ahead like a travel ninja. You need to actually do the work, like Arnold Schwarzenegger says. There's a lot of work that you need to do, even on a vacation. But by planning ahead and doing the work, you'll be able to scout out these restaurants that are vegan restaurants, that are perhaps vegan and gluten-free, that cater for your specific dietary requirements, and you'll have a much more broader selection of meal items, knowing that they fully understand what your dietary restrictions are. And usually when I go on these types of travels, I don't try and go overly aggressive where I'm trying to eliminate all these processed foods. I generally make the exception that I'll consume these foods as long as they're vegan and they're gluten-free, knowing that some of these foods may have processed elements to it. I tend to recognize that these are the exceptions and not usually the norm, and usually where I try and bend my rules a little, that I'm not going fully whole food, plant-based, and making sure that it's super healthy. But I try and at least maintain that core integral function of making sure that it's vegan, gluten-free, and trying to prevent any adverse health reactions from consuming things like gluten, which I know would generally have quite an adverse reaction. So this is something that I found to be really helpful. Planning way in advance, writing down or jotting down all the restaurants that are vegan, where you don't have to ask them 500 questions about the ingredients, knowing that, okay, at least there won't be cross-contamination with meat or with gluten, because they'll have a better understanding of what exactly is vegan and what is gluten-free, so you can enjoy your meal with much more peace of mind from not having to worry about all these cross-contaminations. The other thing about doing the work and doing the research that is pretty helpful is at least you'll have much more peace of mind when you arrive at the location, because you won't be frantically trying to come up or search for a location. And the reason why I always recommend taking a notebook with you, jotting down the names of these places that you'd like to visit, their opening times, closing times, how far they are from your place of stay or wherever you're visiting during the day, so at least you know you have a couple of options where you could go to and find suitable place in case you end up going to one place and they are just jam-packed and they don't have place for you. So that I find can be pretty helpful, and yes, it unfortunately does require a bit of doing the work ahead of the time, which hopefully may help to ensure a much more pleasant experience when you arrive. However, I do recognize there are always those exceptions when you may not have the time to be able to do the work ahead of time. However, at least if you can do some planning even earlier in the day, it can make for a little bit of an easier experience, depending on the location. Obviously, there may be these smaller places that you end up going to that may not be catering for your specific diet, where I have a few more tips up my sleeves to help you navigate those situations as well. So what happens if traveling becomes long-term? If it's a regular part of your life, or you're a digital nomad and you have this luxury of working from anywhere in the world, what then? How do you manage these dietary restrictions? I think in this case, it probably calls for getting back to basics, visiting grocery stores, trying to cook your own meals, trying to keep things as whole food, plant-based as possible, so that you can be saving money as well as saving your gut too. Now, in most of these cases, you probably want to scout out grocery stores, try and find places that have a kitchenette or at least a shared kitchen space where you know you can be preparing your meals and ensuring that you're consuming unprocessed whole foods that are probably better for your gut overall. This next step has probably been a lifesaver on a number of occasions, and that is getting your snacks right. Now, when I'm talking about snacks, most people generally think about candies, sweets, treats, but if you dial in on this and try and aim for nutrient-dense foods, getting these foods right can make quite a difference, because they can keep you satiated for much more longer periods of times. So things that I generally aim for is more nutrient-dense foods, things like overnight oats that I know I can soak with just water. I don't need to have any cooking facilities. I can just have that the next morning and it should keep me good for a number of hours. Now, what I generally try and aim for is I'll either get overnight oats that I can soak and then add things like dates, nuts to that oat mix the next day, so at least it's much more palatable, it tastes good, and you know it's going to last you for a long time. Now, I didn't say I'm perfect in terms of avoiding all these sweet treats. I do try and take things like date bars, date and nut mixes. So these are natural foods. At least there's no processed sugars that I need to be worried about, but at least I'll give you that carb boost if you know you're doing a lot of activities like hiking, walking, a lot of steps during the day, and you're going to need something to at least fuel you up. And I found that these tend to be really helpful in those type of occasions when you're not able to grab a meal immediately, or you just need to be able to sustain on maybe one meal a day at a restaurant or cafe or whatever it is. Then at least you can take care of your food requirements through these snacks throughout the rest of the day. Like I said, try and aim for nutrient dense foods. Think things like chestnuts that you often get packaged today that you can just carry with you. Maybe take a spice bottle so at least you can add your spices to it and make it more palatable. But these dense foods can keep you satiated and feeling much more nourished than just eating candy the whole day. So hopefully dialing in on your snacks can make quite a huge difference in making these trips much more manageable. If you need to go beyond that, then maybe do some research into some of the things that these grocery stores carry out there in the location that you're visiting, so you know you can grab a few things. Sometimes you'll find that they may have certain convenience types foods that you are able to consume. For example, if it's like the onigiri wraps that you get in Japan and locations like that make for pretty easy, convenient meals, just look out for the vegan options that are maybe just made with kelp and that are preservative free. Those can be pretty nutritious and pretty filling as well on these trips if you're trying to generally avoid sugary treats. So here's another tip that can be quite a lifesaver, especially if you're traveling to locations that people are not fluent in English, or you need to be able to navigate a different language and explain to your server exactly what your dietary restrictions are. And that is, try and print out a card that explains exactly what your dietary restrictions are. So explaining what vegan actually entails, meaning no meat, no fish sauce, no eggs, no dairy, meaning no milk, explaining everything in fine detail. And usually those AI tools like ChatGPT can be pretty handy in this case, where you can just ask it to generate for you a list of your dietary restrictions, explaining it in that foreign language so that you can hand it over to your server. And the reason I say print it out is there can often be locations that you visit when Google may not be available because your internet fails. At least you know you have this, and I know it served me pretty well, where I was able to just get out this card, hand it to my server. They acknowledged that they understood my dietary restrictions and could make something that meets those requirements. So that's something that I think can be really helpful. Yes, it takes a bit of doing the work ahead of time, but can make quite a huge difference. So try and make those dietary restriction cards ahead of time and take them with you on your travels. So something else that can come in pretty handy is to carry things like a reusable water bottle that you can fill up with water wherever you're able to find the water fountain or some filtered water, and also to carry a shake bottle, something like this, where you can make your overnight oats in here and you don't have to worry about it spilling over or messing anything, because trying to come up with a solution to try and find reusable cups or worried about somebody knocking it over and spilling it could be quite problematic. And depending where you're traveling, at least this will make things much more convenient when you're trying to prepare certain types of snacks for you for the next day. Tips that I've shared with you today doesn't necessarily mean that I've had smooth experiences ever since I've learned these. There's always those occasions when there's miscommunication or perhaps a little bit of disaster management that I need to handle, or perhaps just relying on my snacks to get me through the day because I'm in a location where they're just not able to cater for me. So these are things that can hopefully help you navigate these dietary restrictions, especially if you're someone who really enjoys traveling and has been putting it off for a long time, hoping for your dietary restrictions to alleviate, where you would be able to incorporate certain foods to make your travels easier, but you're finding yourself, years are going by and you're just not able to get out there and do something that you really enjoy. So hopefully this video helped to give you a little bit of encouragement towards traveling with your dietary restrictions and making it work for you rather than holding yourself back, especially if you love traveling and you love experiencing certain locations and you want to be able to make it work with your existing dietary restrictions. thanks so much for watching. If you've traveled with dietary restrictions, please drop your tips in the comment section below. I'd love to learn from you too. And if any of this resonates with you, please do hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And with that, thanks so much for watching. Safe travels and happy eating, and see you in my next video.